The incident happened on February 18th, 1967. The DeVries family lived in a quiet, forested town in Arkansas known as Cooing Dove. Robert and Judy DeVries raised 4 children, 2 daughters and 2 sons. Robert's father also lived in the home with them. The night of February 18th, Cooing Dove was caught in the middle of a blizzard. It was almost midnight. Nearly every employee at the Cooing Dove police station had clocked out. A few officers and secretaries remained, ensuring no calls came in during the blizzard when emergency help would be difficult to find. A call eventually came in. One of the survivors of the incident reports how the room went silent as the phone rang, and how one of the police officers chuckled to themselves, joking about how it could be teenagers playing a prank call. A secretary picked up the phone, asking if anything was wrong. Judy was on the other end of the line. The secretary said Judy was breathing heavily, and she sounded like she was holding back tears. She was hysterical and couldn't stop talking about how something wasn't right and how her family needed help immediately. As Judy continued to choke on her own words, the secretary calmed her down enough to get an address from her. When the secretary asked Judy to stay on the line, the phone went silent. 2 officers were dispatched to go and investigate the DeVries home. As the roads were bad and the house was not far from the station, they walked through the storm. The officers began their walk through the snowy woods, and the secretaries waited for them to return or call back. Everyone in the station claimed to feel a thick, sinister aura polluting the air, but most assumed it was nothing. All of them felt tired. One began to violently throw up. The vomit spelled a single word: hell. Everyone started to back away, and the feeling in the air only expanded. They cleaned up the puke, put it off as nothing, assuming it was still possible for the word to coincidentally get spelled out. Survivors of the incident recall reminding one another everything was going to be okay. One of the secretaries later mentioned in an anonymous interview how she felt like there was a body hanging from the ceiling and everybody was simply pretending it wasn't there. The officers didn't come back to the station or even call for 30 minutes. It was a 10-minute walk to the DeVries home. Suspicion started to grow amongst the staff. Without a number, they couldn't call the DeVries home, so they decided to send out another officer. Accompanying the officer was a member from the secretary and a canine unit. They went out into the blizzard. When the door was shut as they left, everyone recalls feeling the room rise in temperature. A lone officer recalls dripping with sweat, despite nobody having touched the thermostat. 10 minutes passed. The feeling in the air hadn't thinned any. One secretary described it as thick, bloody, and quietly violent. It was like you could reach your hand out and touch it. Another 10 minutes. Few remember having any conversations at this point. All that was exchanged were glances across the room. The secretary began to mutter curse words, then began to shout about the missing search parties. Another secretary joined in. An officer tried to silence them, but they wouldn't listen. An hour went by. The shouting continued for 30 minutes before the secretaries, gasping for breath, finished by whispering, "Hell." A few went and played pool on the table they had in the back room. Nobody else was sent out to investigate, and there was a sudden knock at the door. One of the secretaries, after hesitation, stood up to answer when there was a blood-curdling scream. They held their hand back from the door handle. A minute went by without any further incidents. The secretary took a deep breath, steeled herself, and opened the door. Standing there was one of the police officers, Michael Sanders. He was shaken, and frostbite was settling in by this point. He wouldn't stop shivering, and he let out another scream, and his breath clouded in the air. Sanders was rushed inside and wrapped with blankets. He couldn't form a coherent sentence. Everybody pounded him with questions. He was one of the officers who had left when the call originally came in. He was mute for 30 minutes. Nobody wanted to go out there into the night. Though the room was getting hotter, many report feeling chills around this time. Sanders was drooling and urinating uncontrollably, but had stopped shivering for the time being. A single drop of blood trickled from his nose before he stood up. One of the secretaries described the way the officer stood as steady, but like he had never been alive before and was in shock of his surroundings. Everyone tried to talk to Sanders, and he only muttered one single word. "Hell," he said. After that, he stood and walked to a nearby bench, sitting down like he didn't trust the bench or that it might cave under his weight. He stared, drooling and urinating for the rest of the night. A few secretaries stayed awake into the early morning, and the rest fell asleep. It was still dark when one of the secretaries decided to go out into the snow. Her name was Carol Rookard. She took a fire axe from the back closet, wore multiple layers, grabbed a flashlight. Carol walked out into the blizzard, and she later reported that she felt a flash of intense heat whir by her. The skies were starless, and the snowfall had not stopped yet. She trudged through the storm, all the way to the DeVries home. There was no sign of the officers anywhere outside. She rang the front doorbell, not expecting a response. She pounded on the door, too, and when no one answered, she looked around for another way to get inside. She wondered if some wild animals had attacked the search parties, but there was no sign of struggle so far. She would later say in an interview that no man becomes that spooked because of a wild animal came up and attacked him, in reference to Sanders. She looked to see if any of the windows were broken or open. None of them were. She looked for the back door and found it also to be locked. 2 metal handles stuck out from the snow, and she realized they were the door handles for a cellar entrance. She tried to open it and managed to do so. She shined the light around the basement, hearing the dripping of water from leaky pipes and finding cobwebs in between the wooden support beams. And the house was silent. She was tempted to call out. Carol recalled that the only audible sounds were the rushing gusts of wind outside. There were no footsteps of officers investigating the house, and there were no axe-wielding murderers torturing the DeVries family. She took cautious steps through the basement until she found the stairs and ascended into the living room. Carol gasped, holding her breath in her throat. Every member of the DeVries family was sitting in the living room. The children played with their toys. The husband held his wife, standing still, and the grandfather relaxed in a rocking chair in the corner, except all of them were frozen. Their teeth were sharp and yellow, gums bleeding, mouths locked into crazy smiles. All of their eyes were gouged out, leaving bloody, gaping voids. Every single one of them had a slit throat, blood coating their clothing. The family was motionless. Carol suppressed her own screams, looking for a landline phone to call the station back. It was sitting on a table in the corner of the room, and she approached it. Carol found the wire had been cut. and apparently chewed on. When she turned around to go back downstairs, she saw a message that had been carved into the wall. It read, "Hell." Carol immediately left the DeVries home and began to sprint back to the police station. She said the evil sensation from before was now shaking through her, flowing in her veins. It was like pure, sheer mania, she said, recounting her run back to the station. It didn't take her long to return. She found the other members of the search parties and the dog, all facing the building. She approached them, asking if they were all right. None of them turned around. She hesitated and stood in place, waiting for them to look at her. One snickered, starting to laugh. He turned his head. His eyes were bloody holes, and his mouth was forced into a toothy grin. Carol screamed. She took a few steps back. She began to sob. The other searchers turned around, including the dog. Their eyes were gone. All of them smiled with yellow teeth. Their throats all split open at once and bled all over their clothes and into the snow. The remaining secretaries inside the police station came out to find the scene. They turned, ran, and slammed the door, locking it. Carol cried for them to help her. Before frostbite kicked in, she pushed herself and sprinted for the door. She knocked and screamed for 10 minutes. She kept looking over her shoulder, seeing the search parties were watching her with their bloody eyes. Someone let Carol in. After, they locked every single window, door, and entrance or exit. They had a member of the staff posted in front of every window to keep guard. The corpses outside never moved. They never made a sound. All they did was stare without eyes and smile. An officer named Keith Strickland mentioned how they would have to do something to get rid of the bodies. He was ignored. The townsfolk found the scene outside in the morning. The bodies were blessed by the local priest and then burned. None of the victims of the killings ever received proper funerals. If they got any type of service at all, it was always organized by the family of the victim. The few mental institutions that were still left in the area around Dove all turned down Michael Sanders when the police station staff tried to take him in. Sanders killed himself in 1978. He jammed 2 forks into his eyes and said, "Hell," and then strangled himself. His brother, James Sanders, watched the whole thing. In an article he wrote about Michael's suicide, James said he didn't try to stop him. He wrote, "I thought that it was time Michael found peace." Carol Ruckert recognized over the course of 2 years that she was losing her sanity and turned her home into a mental hospital for herself. Her husband and 2 sons took care of her until she died of a brain aneurysm in 1978. Everybody else involved in the case of the DeVries killings needed deep therapy. The higher-ups of the Dove Police Department and the town elites tried to cover up the situation, but many around the nation still found out about the DeVries killings. A further investigation found there was no sign of breaking and entering at the DeVries home. There was no blood in the snow to be found whatsoever. It's unknown if the search parties even reached the DeVries home. Now, on February 18th, on the 50th anniversary of the incident, I write this. I descended from the DeVries bloodline, from Robert's older brother, John. I've spent most of my life gathering evidence on the DeVries killings and compiling it all together, and I haven't found any answers other than more questions. So tonight, just before midnight, I'm going to be entering the home with the paranormal expert I hired. The home has been abandoned, and I've searched multiple forums for people who have explored it. Most tell a seemingly fake ghost story. Others say nothing happened. A few tall tales I've heard are a bit more on the realistic side, maybe even truthful. It's 11:30 right now, and I'm going to drive over soon. The snow continues to fall harder. It might be a blizzard by the time I reach the house. I fear I might be underestimating the danger of this all. The only time I get sweaty-handed is when I think about what the DeVries family and the search parties encountered that nobody else has.